We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Disseminate propaganda to influence people's minds, and this is a major function of the CIA.
Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction.
Welcome back to Notify America. We have multiple pressing stories to get to, stories that include a flurry of new papers, proposals, laws that are being released and floated around Washington right now for ways to prepare for an upcoming Trump presidency, all of which have one thing in common: stripping the future president of his powers and likewise possibly stripping the American people of their rights. We're going to explain. Also, a major escalation in the Middle East. We just talked about how this entire thing over there is a giant powder keg waiting to explode, and the Iranians may have just lit the match. Also, another member of the Western elite, this time the Queen of the Netherlands, comes out and supports digital ID to track your jab status, delivering these remarks at the 2024 WEF Global Summit. We have the tape. But before we get started, thank you for liking and sharing these videos. It really helps me out. Also, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you continue receiving these daily updates. The Al-Assad Air Base in Western Iraq, one of the largest U.S. bases in all the Middle East, which houses U.S. forces, by the way, was attacked on Saturday by a barrage of missiles. Reuters, terrible outlet, reported on this, quoting an official who said, quote, "The base was hit by ballistic missiles, but he also left open the possibility it was struck by rockets." Big difference. They go on to speculate in their piece that these ballistic missiles may have been fired from Iranian territory, insinuating that Iran is responsible, which, if true, would be huge. If that happened, we're talking major escalation here. And of course, leave it to Reuters to throw that out there and stir up all the crazies in Washington who would love nothing else but to go to war with Iran. Now, we're also getting reports recently that Hezbollah is taking credit for this. Haven't confirmed that yet. We'll keep you posted, but take a listen to what NBC says. Watch this.
Overseas, a new attack on a U.S. military base in Iraq, and one of the biggest in the region, is raising concerns about a wider conflict in the Middle East. Raf Sanchez joins us now from Tel Aviv. Raf.
Jose, U.S. Central Command says a number of American service personnel are being evaluated for traumatic brain injury after multiple ballistic missiles and rockets were fired at the Al-Assad Air Base in western Iraq. Some of those missiles were intercepted, but others did get through, and the military says it is still assessing the damage. The attack was carried out by an Iranian-backed militant group known as the Islamic Resistance.
In another story, a new law is being proposed by Democrats in the Senate called the Preventing Private Paramilitary Activity Act, written to outlaw private militias in the United States, something that, by the way, is expressly allowed and written into our Constitution. Militias are in the Constitution. The Second Amendment says specifically a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's what the Constitution says. So why would the Senate be trying to outlaw them in all 50 states? Here's what USA Today writes. Private paramilitary actors are a threat to our democracy. Mary McCord, executive director of the Institutional for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown University Law Center, said in a statement. Now, McCord said the new legislation, if enacted, would provide the necessary legal tool to prevent those groups from undercutting the democratic process. Okay, now remember the name of that person that USA Today just quoted, Mary McCord, executive director for the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown University Law Center. It's a mouthful of a name, but remember that because it's going to keep popping up. Well, now Johns Hopkins University just published their own paper and policy recommendations about political violence, and this paper recommends specific gun control provisions that are crucial to stopping what they say is an armed insurrection in the United States. Look at their policy and practice recommendations. Regulate the public carry of firearms. Increase the enforcement of current laws to prohibit paramilitary activity. Prohibit the civilian possession of firearms in locations essential to political participation. Enact and implement extreme risk protection laws to temporarily disarm certain people. repeal or create exceptions for firearm laws to give local government the ability to address risks of insurrectionism in their jurisdictions and break the insurrectionist permission structure. All very odd language, right? And coming out of Johns Hopkins' own Bloomberg School for Public Health, right around the time the Senate's working on this new law about outlawing private militias. And who thinks that an insurrection's like a real thing that's going to happen, an armed insurrection? It's ridiculous. Now, keep in mind, this is all happening in the backdrop, though, of a larger conversation right now, an effort to prepare for a future Trump administration. NBC News, for instance, recently ran a story about how a network of private legal groups and lawmakers are coming together to begin formulating a plan or plans on how to deal with a future Trump presidency, working in concert together to thwart any move Trump makes they deem to be harmful to our democracy. Writing this in the NBC News report, bracing for Trump's potential return, a loose-knit network of public interest groups and lawmakers is quietly devising plans to try to foil any efforts to expand presidential power, which could include pressuring the military to cater to his political needs. We are preparing for litigation and preparing to use every tool in the toolbox that our democracy provides. We believe this is an existential moment for American democracy, and it's incumbent on everybody to do their part. They then go on to quote, guess who? Mary McCord, Executive Director of the Institution for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown Law. Again, in this separate article about containing Donald Trump, she's quoted saying, we're already starting to put together a team to think through the most damaging types of things that he, Trump, might do, so we're ready to bring lawsuits if we have to. Look, we reported on this last week, but there are stories like this popping up all over the place. So they either really believe Trump is this dangerous or his supporters are this dangerous, which I doubt that they believe that, or they're using this hyperbolic language to scare people. Media constantly talking about insurrection, private militias rising up, maybe even scare people enough to convince them new laws need to be passed to provide the state more power and chisel away at our rights in the process. Just a thought. In another story, independent media continues to outperform traditional corporate media. Good riddance. We have the numbers. Trust in traditional media has plummeted. In a Gallup poll conducted in 2023, only 32% of the public say they still trust the mass media, historic low. And if you break it up by political leaning, you could see people who lean Democrat have a much higher confidence in traditional media than independents and Republicans do. Well, the people in charge are finally realizing this, and they're getting nervous. At a roundtable discussion at the WEF's annual summit last week, the Wall Street Journal's editor-in-chief, Emma Tucker, reminisces about yesteryear, a better time when the public inherently trusted whatever the media told them. Watch this.
If you go back really not that long ago, as I say, we owned the news. We were the gatekeepers, and we very much owned the facts as well. If it said it in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, then that was a fact. Nowadays, people can go to all sorts of different sources for the news, and they're much more questioning about what we're saying. So it's no longer good enough for us just to say, this is what happened, or this is the news. We have to explain our working. So readers expect to understand how we source stories. They want to know how we go about getting stories. We have to sort of lift the bonnet, as it were, and in a way that newspapers aren't used to doing, and explain to people what we're doing. We need to be much more transparent about how we go about collecting the news. Here's what she said, quote, if you go back not that long ago, we owned the news. We were the gatekeepers, and we very much owned the facts as well, unquote. It's a pretty remarkable statement, isn't it? Now, she says more people are questioning nowadays what they're saying, how they have to divulge sources and methods, things like that. Like that's a bad thing? I would think that's a good thing. And it's not surprising after all the mistakes these people have made over the years. In another story, again, out of the WEF, as more proposals and plans continue pouring out of Davos following their annual summit last week, because realize, there's like hours and hours of live footage from that event. It takes a long time to sift through it all. We're talking around 100+ hours of live video feeds, a week straight of almost nonstop speeches and roundtable discussions, also off-the-book meetings that took place on the sidelines. Obviously, we'll never be able to know or see or learn about, but the dialogue that was aired publicly
is intended for public consumption, intended to be broadcasted to everyone on what the Western oligarchy, or Western aristocracy in this case, is hoping to achieve in the future. Here's Queen Maxima of the Netherlands explain how digital ID is the future, and very important for all of these reasons that she gives, but also for keeping track of who got their jab and who didn't. Watch this.
When I started this job, there were actually very little countries in Africa or Latin America that had one ubiquitous type of ID, and certainly that it was digital, and certainly that it was biometric. And we've really worked with all our partners to actually help that being, to grow this. And the interesting part of it is that, yes, it is very necessary for financial services, but not only.
Sure.
It's also good for school enrollment. It's also good for health, who actually got a vaccination or not. It's very good to get your subsidies, from the government.
All right, that wraps up this episode. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.